Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 25th of April 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, Brian Gerrish, and we're joined by Alex Thomson with Eastern Approaches. Alex, of course, reporting from the Netherlands. Rebuilding
Syria. Apparently $6 billion is what they were aiming to do at the beginning of this meeting at the EU yesterday. $6 billion for Syria, but only if Assad is gone. So this is the third annual conference on Syrian reconstruction. Well, their position, as I say, on reconstruction in Syria, according to many outlets and them themselves, is the rebuilding of cities such as Aleppo can't start until powers involved in what they describe as a proxy war back a peaceful transition of power away from Bashar al-Assad. So what was Russia's response to this? Well, Sergei Lavrov said, speaking about Syria's restoration, we're very alarmed by the West loudly announcing their stance that they won't provide any assistance to those areas which are under the control of the Syrian government. He said that we will see how the conference organisers, most notably the European Union and other Western countries and participants, will outline their stance on the pressing tasks of restoring Syria's economy. Well, Lavrov doesn't need to worry because Penny Mordaunt announced this morning. She said, she didn't say this, but this is what she would have said if she had been asked. She said, "Don't worry, Sergei. We're giving another £450 million to support our white-helmeted terrorists there." And this is a new UK aid commitment to protect civilians, they say, aid workers and hospitals targeted by the Assad regime. So they're going to provide medical support, emergency medical support, and help protect medical facilities and brave humanitarian workers being deliberately targeted in Syria. Mordaunt said that with at least 30,000 people currently injured every month in Syria, it's expected that around a quarter of this UK aid support in Syria will be spent on healthcare next year. Well, of course, this is to support the British supported rebels, terrorists. We can describe them as we wish. But in the meantime, of course, in the last couple of weeks, we've had airstrikes in Syria. Well, one of the outcomes seems to be, as Haaretz says here, everyone's talking about Russia's S-300s. Why now, and why should Israel be worried? This is what they're concerned about. They're saying that Russia's S-300 advanced air defense system has become almost a byword over the last decade for a strategic advantage sought by Iran and Syria to counter Israel's dominance in the air. For years, Israel lobbied the Kremlin not to supply the system to them, and indeed, despite paying for it in 2007, Iran only received its first S-300 batteries in 2016. They make the point that, well, there are S-300s in Syria already in the hands of the Russians, but they're concerned that one of these is going to, become property of the Syrian government. And Alex, I suppose the main concern is that they assume that at some point Russia will leave Syria and take their S-300s with them. But if Syria actually owns one, then on a long-term basis, their ability to strike Syria in the way that they have in the past may be somewhat curtailed.
This is a miscalculation which the West could easily make because even back to the Soviet days, in fact, predominantly in the Soviet days, Syria was a strategic ally of the Soviet Union. And in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, Syria actually renewed its license to be involved with Russia in the development of the biological and chemical weapons, which have been so much controversial in more recent times. They were scrapped, of course, under OPCW supervision, not that the West seems to know this. When it comes to air defenses, the same applies. Syria is, well, you could call it a client state, to use slightly more detrimental language, but Syria is very much a kind of forward placement for Russia along the Mediterranean, and Russia does have a self-preserving habit of giving these its kit. Armenia is another example, although they've had a revolution this week and they may be less anti-Russian from now on. These countries in the Near East that actually have the presence that Russia lacks for Navy, Air Force, forward projection of Russian power, So if Syria does manage to get hold of S-300s itself, and that's before we get onto the S-400, which Russia would probably not sell, and Moscow is even protected by something bigger than that, better than that, then Syria will actually be able in perpetuity to hold off any American or European fighters of the current generation and Israeli. And that is something that nobody's banked on.
And what's your assessment of the capability of the F-35 against an S-300? Yeah, I'm trying not to laugh while I ask the question even.
We would need some more stats. We have some forthcoming detail on the F-35 later, but let's not forget there are different models of it. Britain, if I'm not mistaken, is getting the F-35C. There's ABC and I think D versions available, but the fly-by-wire systems they have are the same. In fact, some American high-ups are talking to the Pentagon and Congress now about basically the F-35. In their view, this is Air Force, well, we would call them vice marshals. I think they call them generals in the US Air Force. Their assessment is it's just a computer which happens to fly. So that there's, we've got to the 5th generation of fighters now, but the Russian approach to 5th generation fighters is much like the Swiss approach to railway engineering, deliberately go low tech, as much mechanical as possible, because that doesn't get jammed or suddenly go kaput. So the Russians have 5th generation Sukhoi and so on, which actually are very nimble and can stay in the air whatever you do to them. The US, and through their boondoggles, the European approach to strike fighters of the 5th generation is cram as much bombing and electronics on as board as you can, and it's aerodynamically unstable, and it'll fall out of the air the moment the computers stop calculating every microsecond how to fly. So against any sophisticated air defense of the post-Soviet era like the S-300, they're toast.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Craig Murray pushed this out yesterday. Just watched open-mouthed the Macron-Trump press conference, in which the big idea seemed to be the reinstatement of France's colonial power in Syria in an anti-Iranian alliance. Not convinced this is what Trump voters thought they were getting, or Macron's. Well, I have to say, anybody that saw any of the shenanigans of these two, it was pathetic, wasn't it? As they ran around together, hand in hand, kissing each other. It was terrible. But Trump said, that he would love to get out of Syria. He said, with that being said, Emmanuel and myself have discussed the fact that we don't want to give Iran open season in the Mediterranean, especially since we really control it to a large extent. We're going to be coming home relatively soon. That's the United States. We've finished at least almost our work with respect to ISIS in Syria, ISIS in Iraq, and we've done a job that nobody has been able to do. I really wonder whether he's been watching the same current events as we have, because I'm not certain that the United States had anything whatsoever to do with the defeat of ISIS in Syria or in Iraq. But anyway, with that being said, he said, I do want to come home, but I want to come home also with having accomplished what we have to accomplish. So we're discussing Syria as part of an overall deal. When they've made the Iran deal, they should have made a deal that covered Yemen, that covered Syria, and that covered other parts of the Middle East. Alex, I don't know if you saw any of the press conference. At one point, Donald Trump was sort of brushing Macron's shoulder and explaining to the awaiting press that he was removing the last bit of dandruff from Macron's shoulder. Is this the way that a US president should be speaking to a French president? What's your take on this new friendly special relationship that he's talking about?
Well, we could come at it any which way, but it's going to be very eyebrow-raising for the French because, of course, yes, Macron has tried to restore the usual prestige and the gloire de la France idea of the presidency, but that doesn't involve being, I think there's a word for it now, bromanced by a fellow world leader. Picking dandruff off collars was the kind of thing which was, in the 50s, held to be indicative of a love affair. In fact, there was a minor royal that fell that way, if I remember, in the 50s. So it is rather disconcerting, shall we say the least. I think that, well, we'll see a bit more about France later in the programme, but what's gone on at the deepest level is Macron has proven to be a smart cookie. He's got oodles more charm than Merkel, for example, and Theresa May is a lame duck for various reasons. So the British cabals are not able to steer the US through the usual deep state mechanisms. They've been blown open, especially in the States now, a lot of channels talking about them. So how does the US, or how does the deep state of the banking network control this supposedly dumb beast of the US, which is supposed to be always asleep and throwing its weight around without realizing what it's doing? Well, it can't be done through the usual British channels anymore. The Germans are going off script, so it has to be the French. And so Macron has been activated. He's a Rothschild asset to the core. And now he's being told to throw on the charm, use his asset of fluent English and his photogenic abilities to charm the pants off this rather indiscreet old man, as far as I can make out. Like, I haven't got a good word to say for Trump in this. His discretion has just gone out the window, hasn't it? You could say he's being bullied at home by the Pentagon and through things like the theft of his dossiers from his lawyers, which puts his children at risk. But here on a foreign trip, to lark about like this is indicative of something, I think, even deeper going wrong.
Alex, excuse me, Alex, thank you for that. You're mentioning the deep state. Is interesting to see political policy just drift through various governments. So the UK starts it, UK pushing hard for regime change, then it swings to the US, then it's back to France. But this is working constantly. It doesn't matter what country it is in principle, the agenda stays the same. Well, if you're going to do this sort of type of politics, you need to have a good propaganda arm. So let's have a look at the BBC in action. And I'll say thank you to the people that alerted me to this BBC interview.
Just that so many challenging things are happening in the world, but that so much disinformation is spread about them. How can we even have a proper conversation about things going wrong when so many people seem intent on dividing and confusing us with falsehoods? This is, in reality, an understandable mashup of connected concerns: conspiracy theories on social media, falsehoods propagated by politicians, and the worries about clever targeting techniques by people like Cambridge Analytica. But of late, it's the geopolitical nonsense that's been at the fore, deliberate falsehoods spread by nations, one nation in particular, about chemical attacks or whatever. These are designed to breed distrust. Propaganda is hardly new, but it does feel like the game has changed. Gabriel Gatehouse has been trying to work out the new rules.
Hello, welcome to a world of total relativism. This is a world with as many realities as there are points of view. In this game, seeing and believing have switched places. It may look confusing at first, but don't worry, sit down, relax. You might like it here, then again, you might not. On the 7th of April, pictures emerged that appeared to show children in Douma, the suburb of Damascus, being treated after a chemical attack. The Syrian government has used chemical weapons in the past. The view in the West was clear. It looked like they'd done it again.
If they are found to be responsible, the regime and its backers, including Russia, must be held to account.
Well, just incredible stuff, Mike. What are you watching there? Are you watching proper investigative journalism? Are you watching docudrama? Is it a cartoon? Lots of questions to be asked about what the BBC is presenting. But I thought how slick, the clear liquid into the shot glass, I think is supposed to be vodka.
Yeah.
And that puts the twist on it. But if you listen to what the BBC presenter said, he said, is it conspiracy? Is it falsehoods by, or it is falsehoods by politicians? We've got problems with targeting by Cambridge Analytica. And then he says, well, forget all that. This is deliberate falsehoods by nation states. So the spin throughout the whole of that introduction by the BBC, just astonishing. And of course, what the BBC doesn't want to talk about is the fact that the British government has lied before in order to have regime change. So weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, no proof, nothing given to the British public. And on the basis of that, we go to war. Similar model in Syria. The BBC is not going to investigate. The whole thing spun as a BBC propaganda piece on Russia. I think it's just so clear cut, but let's follow through with two additional clips from this BBC report.
Неопровержимые данные о том, что это была постановка очередная. И к этой постановке приложили руку спецслужбы одного государства, которое сейчас рвется быть в первых рядах русофобской кампании.
That certain country, Russian officials made clear, is Britain. In war, there are often disagreements over who's responsible for an attack, but this is different.
The narrative has evolved over time, so as soon as the attacks were reported, you saw well-known pro-Kremlin and pro-Assad internet trolls advancing the narrative that this was a genuine attack but had been committed by the rebels. But then quickly you had more official sources, so particularly the Russian Foreign Ministry and the Russian Defense Ministry, saying the whole story is a fake, the images are a fake, the videos are fake, the story is a provocation.
In the real world, this is a binary situation.
Followed up by Russian internet trolls.
Russian internet trolls.
Yeah.
And we're going to have a look at this in a bit of detail. They're all Russian internet trolls. But who is that man and what is his background? Well, of course, he was a NATO press spokesman. So his whole background is NATO. We can expect him to follow a pro-NATO line. And now he's moved through to work with the Atlantic Council on Digilabs. So one more quick piece and then we'll just follow through on that gentleman himself, Mr. Nimmo.
My judgment as Prime Minister is that this threat is real, growing and of an entirely different nature to any conventional threat to our security that Britain has faced before.
The programme in the form that we thought it was did not exist in the way that we thought, so I can apologise for that.
Russia makes no secret of the fact that it believes it's fighting an information war.
So there we are. The Russians used Tony Blair, first of all, saying that he had the evidence, the weapons of mass destruction, to go to war. And then we see Tony Blair obviously backpedaling that there was no evidence to go to war in Iraq. And when the Russians put that evidence forward, which meets with the BBC's introduction of falsehood by politicians, when the Russians put that evidence forward, that's propaganda, Mike.
Yes.
Just astonishing twist by the BBC, but of course what they don't say is their principal man is a former NATO spokesman. So let's have a look at how this goes with Mr. Nimmo. Sorry, I'll just bring him on back on screen so that we know the gentleman. His label comes up a couple of times, one as former NATO press spokesman, but here he is as Ben Nimmo, Digital Forensic Research Lab, Atlantic Council. So who is this speaking? Well, here's Atlantic Council working together to secure the future, renewing the Atlantic community for global challenges. And what is this organisation about? Well, have a look at the people. And we've got Mr. Jones here as the interim, James Jones as the interim chairman, and Frederick Kemp. So let's look at Mr. Jones here. And what we've got is General Jones, US Marine Corps, retired. He's the chairman. And what does he believe in? Well, he spent his life serving and protecting America and American ideals. So this is hardly going to be unbiased investigative journalism. This man is a full-blown United States and NATO policy man. And if we go to number 2, Fred Kemp is the President and Chief Executive of the Atlantic Council. Under his leadership, it's had this meteoric growth. But what is his background? Wall Street Journal. So we're straight into the establishment and we're into the political military establishment. And this is the source of the BBC spokesman. His Digital Forensic Lab. Logical fallacies fuel Kremlin disinfo. So it's an attack on the Kremlin without any real evidence at all. Here's the blurb: Understanding Disinformation. Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab has operationalized the study of disinformation by exposing falsehoods and fake news, documenting human rights abuses and building digital resilience worldwide. And who gave them permission to do that? Well, nobody knows. But this is the bit that I really found amusing, that when you look at Digital Lab, they boast that they're using open source and social media material. So when they choose the material and put it forward, we have to believe it. But if members of the public use their own intelligence and research social media and open source material, then that is effectively pro-Russian propaganda. And if we want to know who the team is for this, well, most of them are very young, but they're anonymous. There's a face, but there's no background to who these people are or what their credentials are. And we'll just come back to Mr. Nimmo, because in that film clip, he basically smears anybody who challenges the UK government's view, you are pro-Kremlin. He went for this blogger in particular. This is Ian56, who also appears in this BBC clip. But what I found on Ben Nimmo's Twitter page is that he's now backtracking. In fact, the only sources that I've seen so far for the accusation I called Ian a Russian bot or a Kremlin bot are pro-Kremlin and pro-Assad trolls marked by targeted and routinely abusing rhetoric and conspiracy sites. Now, what did he actually say? Well, let's bring it in. He said they all work together, they all amplify the same messaging, they all support the Russian government's narrative, and they all attack the Russian government's critics. So here is his evidence, which is baseless, Mike.
Well, Brian, first of all, he did say that Ian56 was a Russian bot, and there was some comment on whether what he meant was a Russian troll, but I have to say, I don't know Ian56. Do you know him? I'm certainly not working directly with him.
Absolutely. I have now seen him on Sky. Well, he's actually on Sky. This was an interview that Sky did with him, and they said to him, are you a Russian bot? And he said, no. This is the important thing, he said. The UK government is singling out for attack anyone who calls out the UK government lies on what's been happening recently. Yeah. But notice what Sky did. While this man was attempting to defend himself, you've got the undertitle there, basically labelling him on screen as a Russian bot.
Yeah.
So this is disgraceful stuff. And we just go into this. This is Digilab's Twitter page, where they've got this very, very childish graphic. Our latest on how the Kremlin and its disinformation networks use logical fallacies to dismiss, dismay, distract and distort. And we've got little 5-year-old children's cartoon diagrams with no evidence, no substance what's at all. This is just supposition. But the goldfish caught my eye because I thought this was wonderful. Let's have a look at the goldfish. Here he is, jumping to conclusion without sufficient evidence. That's what's thrown at the Kremlin, but the onus is on the UK government and the US government to produce the evidence.
Yes, because they're making the allegations.
They're making the allegations, but there is no evidence. There is no evidence from the UN, the US, or anywhere else. So this is just twisting things on its head with no real substance. And I'd like to remind Digilab that the BBC itself boasted that it had its operatives through BBC Media Action working in Syria to help foment trouble within Syria itself, and of course help push things towards the violence for the regime change. So how Digilab can work with the BBC, I don't know. Alex, if I may, I'm lost for words again on this, because what is happening is so blatant. It is the United Kingdom and the government which are pushing out the propaganda.
Yes, and not only can pretty much everyone see that in Britain now, Brian, the Europeans can as well. They have lost the kind of deference they used to have to the BBC with the establishment voice, trust us, we're the BBC. And very interestingly, I was having a kind of clandestine dinner yesterday with one of these continental young politicians who's actually a lot more anti-regime in Europe than he's supposed to be. And he's one of, he tells me, several who have been funded by Federica Mogherini's outfit to produce fake news reports for, I think they call it East Strat 4, there is an EU one and a NATO one, basically copies of this Atlantic Council cell, which supposedly debunks the Kremlin and slings mud at them. And he said, well, we're all being funded to produce these fake news reports, but Mogherini ain't going to be pleased with them when we come out with them, because we will be pointing in a different direction. And as for the Atlantic Council, well, we never want to sound smarmy towards our US cousins, but they are, I think they recognise themselves that they're easily taken for a ride by British establishment voices and by Eastern European passion sometimes. And a lot of that swelling growth in the Atlantic Council's ranks has been various former Soviet Union, shall we say, second and third rate intellectuals who've come to a US, in most cases, a US university, and hung on. And they have been taken on as staff writers, writing way beyond their expertise. And this is going to burn the Atlantic Council, which is basically NATO's think tank, very much in the fingers, because we've got Ukrainians talking about the situation in the Caucasus, Armenians writing about the situation in Poland. They don't know any more about it than you or I would, Brian, or shall we say a non-specialist from our country. And one of these days, this is all going to go up in smoke.
Alex, what do you think? Is there a strategy here? I mean, I can imagine a couple of possible scenarios. We have, as I've made this point before, we are now living in this post-truth world. This is their term. They've chosen it. And it's not a reflection of an observation of what's going on around them. This is a policy statement, I believe, the post-truth world. So they are absolutely flooding people with lies, obfuscation, disingenuous statements, lack of evidence. They're just bombarding. In fact, in order to bombard people with the level of stuff that they're being bombarded with, they can't possibly be doing the research and gathering the evidence, right? So is that an effort to drown out through the level of noise that they create? Is that an effort to drown out the voices of sanity? Or is that an effort to simply make people so jaded with the quantities of information that they're having hurled at them that they just switch off from it all? Or is it a combination of those, do you think? What are your thoughts on that?
I think you could combine the two descriptions you just made there, Mike. I think the key thing is it's supposed to be jarring to the viewer and listener. We often hear, perhaps too much now, this term cognitive dissonance, which has a technical psychological meaning that only qualified people really can explain to us. But in its popularized sense, cognitive dissonance, the idea that I'm hearing two channels of world truth and they can't both be right, so I'm confused, is very much a weapon. Back in the days when the beast, as it were, was headquartered in the Soviet Union, when it was communism, trying to conquer the world from their global revolutionary strategy, there was open talk about these terms disinformacja, disinformation, and indeed the use of this word provokacja for false flag, which you often hear Russians talking now about provocations. They actually do mean false flags, although that usually isn't translated as such. These strategies go back decades. They're written about by British and American, but largely British intellectuals in the interwar era. And then shortly after the Second World War, of course, George Orwell talks about them as well. It's not the case that we're digging this up from old-fashioned sci-fi. It's that these plans were in place in the West and simply went to sleep for some decades while the communist strategy or the Marxist revolutionary strategy outbedded itself from the Soviet Union into the West. And now they're coming to the fore again. So the geographical locations have switched, but the techniques are very much the kind that you would expect to see in the Soviet Union and the German Democratic Republic in the 60s.
Mm. Okay, thank you very much for that.
Media on trial.
Media on trial is the answer. Absolutely, that is the answer. Details at mediaontrial.uk. Tickets are available for the event taking place in Leeds on the 27th of May. Get there if you can.
Okay, and we're also going to remind people May the 12th for the NHS and the Health Conference. And if you haven't already got your tickets, please get onto the UK Column website and get some tickets. And also, will you please help us by spreading news of this event, which is going to be very important in terms of health and the NHS. We'll also remind people Friday 4th of May, Alternative View 9, residential tickets all gone, but there are day tickets still available and some room for seats. Yes.
So, Alex, where are we now? What's behind the collapse in US airmanship? This we're seeing increasing. It's not just in airmanship, is it? It's seamanship as well. But for this one, you want to focus on the airmanship side of it?
Yes, and perhaps while the slide's on screen, you could read, well, perhaps some of the middle paragraph would be good for you to read, Mike, if you've got better sight of it than I have. This is a letter sent in by Staff Sergeant Preston Haskell, who's with the 432nd Aircraft Maintenance Squadron, a crucial part of any Air Force, at Creech Air Force Base, Nevada.
It says, one of the most cherished feelings I have about our military is how integrated and multifaceted we all are. I absolutely love that I work with people from almost every background, race and religion our nation has to offer. So why would the Air Force encourage division? You're allowed to be proud and even proclaim that pride in being black, Latino, homosexual, atheist or transgender, yet I cannot proclaim my pride in being a white, heterosexual male Christian without serious reprimand. This division is encouraged and supported by the Air Force.
That's right. So I'm hearing this from Americans stationed in Europe. In fact, in some cases in Germany, you've got US Air Force and US Army bases in the same metropolitan area. And apart from having punch-ups on Friday nights when they go boozing in town, there's a cultural problem as well. You can see that they're not on the same page. The Air Force has long been derided by more grunty parts of the military, like the Marines, as the so-called chair force, because it's mostly office jobs these days. But this is a particularly close example of how the airmanship, which in the US model is in 3 branches of service. It's in the Air Force, the Navy and the Marines, and the latter 2 train together. And they're the really high testosterone pilots that get close to the enemy, Navy and Marine pilots. They are, in some senses, they're the war-winning pilots because they take the biggest risks and have to have very split-second reactions. But on the US Air Force side, this has been pioneered as well. The airmanship back at home, when people are in stateside positions, is based around pushing paper around, ticking boxes, and providing a make-work scheme for a lot of people who wouldn't, frankly, get very far in the private sector in the US, because their abilities aren't up to it. And this model started with the tailhook scandal in 1991, where all the Navy pilots and Marine pilots were hauled over the coals because of some sexual harassment or attitudes towards women on base. Brian has read more into it. I'd be interested in his view, because I put this on screen largely because it resonates exactly with what Brian has been following, coming out of first the US Navy and Marine pilots, and then into the other flying branches of the US, and then ultimately into the British military as well, sowing division by fake political correctness and bogus concerns about diversity.
Well, Alex, I think the simplest thing I can add to that is that a lieutenant commander from the US Navy many years ago, Dr. Gerald Atkinson, wrote 2 books on what he saw was happening. He was extremely concerned about what was seen as a breakdown of morale within the US forces, and what was breaking down morale amongst servicemen and women were new diversity, social inclusion policies. So the very policies that said they were there to help people work together as teams, he identified were actually having the opposite effect and causing trouble. What I'll do in one of the forthcoming news programs is we'll have a look at one of his books where he explains how this system worked. But I think we're seeing the fruits of that policy coming home to roost in the American armed forces.
Alex, what's going on the European military side? You've got one here. Greece to lease French warships amid Aegean tensions with Turkey, but as well as that, you're concerned about French and German loss of trust in US arms and policy. You've got 2 articles here. One saying Pentagon halts F-35 deliveries from Lockheed Martin due to dispute over repair costs, and the fact that Merkel has, FP saying that Merkel has disastrously bungled her relationship with Trump.
Well, these are all diplomatically written by good US-based sources who've got the right analysis, at least on the articles in question, apart from the first one, which was by the French version of The Local, which is a title franchised all over the world for people to read the host country news in English. Now, to take the local.fr first, this is, I have to say, a bit of a vindication of the line I've been taking for a while, that France is seeking to turn the countries which are necessary for the ownership of the seabed of the southern and eastern Mediterranean, which are hydrocarbon rich, turning those countries into virtual protectorates. Total interest, which is the French, effectively state oil business, were behind the Gaddafi overthrow, as people are becoming aware. More latterly, Cyprus, Egypt and Greece have been in this kind of north-south axis of willing French protectorates to stand up against Turkey. And you can see this really coming out into the open at a rate of knots, with the Greeks deciding almost overnight to lease 2 French, I think serious frigates, the Languedoc and the Provence, I think are the names of them, named after 2 southern parts of France. And these are going to be provided to the Greek Navy for 5 years. And it was so hasty that the Greek ministers didn't questioned about it on the eve of the decision, said, we don't even know about this yet. But Macron had decided it personally with the Greek Prime Minister. And in the 2 articles by US sources on the Germans, greatly disillusioned with President Trump, especially in foreign policy. And as the article says, the Germans are very moralistic in their foreign policy, so they're going off in a huff and deciding to hasten EU military union, whereas the French approach is still to keep the Americans sweet and on board, at least for the purpose of muscle. But Franco-German thinking is very much now that the southern and eastern Mediterranean has to become directly commanded by the French, as well as the kit that's being provided. There's the training. Saint-Cyr, CYR, is the French equivalent of Sandhurst or West Point. And a lot of Eastern European countries' officers are being trained there in basically to become an extension of the French military in thinking terms. That F-35 piece from SOFREP News wouldn't even say which 2 European countries have turned their nose up at their F-35 deliveries. I suspect one of them may be Germany.
But in the meantime, Germany rearming, you say like it's 1936 is how you're describing it?
Yes, the Defence Minister Ursula von der Leyen has got just shy of €500 million of demands to be approved for the budget. And on the right, people can see the statistics there for how much kit the Germans have on paper as of 2016 and how much is in service. There's some shockers there. Perhaps Brian might want to pick out a couple that stand out to him. But I would say this is actually from the official report for 2016, the last values available, by the Armed Forces Commissioner of the German Federal Parliament, the Bundestag. This is Herr Bartels, who is actually a prime driver of EU military union, who's been arguing for it for decades before anyone else. And he is the chap who is deliberately perhaps fudging this on the low side to say, look, all our kit is falling apart, not just the Tornadoes, which are ending their surface life, but all the other stuff as well. So that perhaps to give more power to Ursula von der Leyen's elbow at the German MOD to say, look, we need to build a completely new generation of kit ourselves, which, of course, the last time this happened was 1936.
And even going as far as to manufacture their own air defences?
Yes, and this is a couple of weeks old, but the key is that Rheinmetall, which sounds ominous, it's basically a German conglomerate of steel and so on, is bidding very hard to produce an alternative to the US Patriot air defenses, which riles the Russians so much because it's also an offensive system. And Rheinmetall at the same time is getting well into kitting out the Australian armed forces. Germany is becoming an arms exporter, and they've got the whole suite now, except fighters, and even there, fighters and drones. They're increasingly, with the Israelis on the one hand and the French on the other, more Israel for drones and France for fighters, they are basically becoming a self-sufficient production block for an EU military force.
Okay, Brian, and well, we've got some parliamentary questions about deployments in Syria.
Yes, and I think they're very, very important. We've got questions between Lloyd Russell Moyle, this is the 23rd of April, and Mark Lancaster, the Minister of State, Ministry of Defence. So Lloyd Russell Moyle says, to ask the Secretary of State for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, pursuant to answer of 28th of March to question 133652 on Syria peacekeeping operations, how many UK ground troops have been operating in Syria, including those embedded with US forces, from which regiment those troops came from and where in Syria they were based. And Mark Lancaster's answer is, details of UK armed forces embedded in other countries' forces are published annually in the Ministry of Defence annual report and account. For reasons of operational and personal security, we do not provide details on the units or locations of the embedded personnel. More broadly, UK armed forces are playing a leading role in the global coalition to defeat Daesh. The UK has around 1,400 military personnel committed to counter Daesh operations across the Middle East. So the answer is, we're not going to tell you, basically. And then if we follow it through with this one, so we've got a statement by Mark Lancaster. I haven't got the original question, but he says, as the government has stated previously, if the UK resorts to the use of lethal force outside of an armed conflict against an armed attack or the imminent threat of an armed attack, Parliament will be notified. However, for security and operational reasons, such notification may need to be after any such use of force has taken place. So basically, we can put troops in and invade a country, and Parliament doesn't necessarily need to know. We can attack a country, and we may tell you.
But he doesn't specify how long it might take him to. I mean, it could take 10 years. Maybe he won't even be in government anymore.
Well, possibly.
Okay. Good news, Brian and Alex. The Changemakers are here. Here they are in collaboration with Bloomberg. This is the Changemakers 2018 conference is going on at the moment. And our illustrious ex-digital minister now, Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, was speaking at it. He was explaining that the pace of change that we're living through now is in fact the slowest pace of change that we will experience for the rest of our lifetime. So that's a pleasant thought.
Okay. How does he know that?
Well, we'll come on to that. He said, "I'm delighted to be here on this day to celebrate the changemakers. Changemakers in the world of culture and, of course, digital transformation are having a phenomenal impact. And this is a pace of change that the world has never seen before. And today," he said, "I want to go through 3 areas where I think our focus needs to be laser-like to make this happen." So that's how it's going to happen. That's how he knows it, because he's going to make it happen. First, the right business environment. Second, the right talent. And thirdly, the right ethics. So first of all, governments around the world need to set the conditions not just for a thriving digital economy, but also one that generates positive social change. And so he cited Big Society Capital, the world's first wholesale social investor fund that was set up 5 years ago by this government. And it has already committed £1 billion to social sector organisations. So that's how the change is going to happen. Right. If we want to create the right business environment, we've also got to get the right talent, though. So he is working with industry to support the Tech Talent Charter, and he's concerned that there's a lack of gender diversity in our tech industry. And that brought him, he said, to the third and final principle that I wanted to touch on, and that's the importance of answering the deep and searching ethical questions posed by new technology. But while the digital revolution promises these vast benefits, it also raises challenging questions. Is it right, for example, for companies to predict our sexuality, our sexuality and ethnicity, and tailor their services as a result? Is it right to have an algorithm to dictate who should be saved in a car crash? And what do we do if coding starts to reflect and replicate the unconscious biases that exist in society today? But it was his conclusion that really grabbed me. He said, so the message I want to leave you with is this: whenever people try to hold back the change makers, they will lose. And this is especially true when it comes to technology, whether it's the Luddites smashing up the early textile machinery, or the horse and cart drivers who protested the Victorian railways, or those who rallied against commercial TV in the UK. History tells us we can't fight new technology, but we can shape it. So I'm on the side of the disruptors. There isn't a single business model out there that can't be improved over time through the transforming power of technology, because the marketplace of ideas is the best thing for customers. It means a race to the top in how we make services better and products easier, faster, and more efficient, and ultimately benefit our fellow man. And it creates wider benefits for society as a whole. So blessed are the change makers, and it's the role of governments around the world to give them what they need to succeed, and that's what we plan to do. So there you go.
So we've determined the policy. You're going to get it. It's pointless trying to do anything about it because we're going to steamroll it over you. But interesting, Alex, he's using disruptive, and of course this was the policy revealed by those 2 Tory politicians whose name escapes me at the moment, but a few years ago they said the Tories were going to use positive chaos in order to change the country.
What's striking about that, Brian and Mike, is that the things that Matt Hancock was reeling off in his spiel there were actually the very points raised in a much more even-handed paper by the Royal Flemish Academy, released a couple of months ago here nearby here in Belgium in that case, discussing the GDPR, the new European Union data protection framework, the scope for innovation, unconscious bias in algorithms, will algorithms crash cars, etc. But the difference is that whereas the Flemish piece said these are real challenges and we need to think seriously about whether we're entering a nightmare era, the British government in the persona of Matt Hancock is saying, get out of our way, we're going to impose it on you. as far as I can see from those remarks. So we've got to the point where European continental political culture is less tyrannical than British, which I never thought I would see.
Yeah, and the two names were Bowles, the MP Bowles, and the Conservative candidate Danny Kruger.
Are we going to end on this one?
Well, the other one is very short, but
okay.
I think it's worth popping in.
Okay, so Alex, you just wanted a quick reminder on the Hofschröer appeal?
The clock is still ticking. Go and find out about Peter Hofschröer from our Dispatches from the Front podcast. We've got nearly 2,500 of what we need initially for Peter's time-sensitive case, which we need €11,000 or £10,000 or so for. This is to get him out of the mental institution where he's been confined totally unlawfully in Austria. Now, a huge donation was made here by a certain Norman Scarth, one of our Grade A war heroes who's fled to Ireland after persecution. And Norman Scarth gave some comments to me together with his extremely generous donation, which I'll keep as short as possible. Norman Scarth writes, "I urge you to support whistleblower Peter Hofschröer. Exposing corruption that Peter Hofschröer had been doing is a dangerous occupation. Whatever crimes, so-called, Peter may have committed, if any, they are as nothing compared to the crimes against him by the British state and now by Austria. Nobel laureate Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote, 'To put a sane man in a madhouse is worse than the gas chambers.' And that is exactly what is likely to happen to anyone who dares to expose the corruption which is rampant in Britain. I now know that the same thing happens in Austria." And he goes on in detail, more than I can read out, but he ends up, "Success for Peter Hofschröer would help many more people. There is no more worthy cause, and we urge you to make a financial contribution if you possibly can. I myself," says Norman Scarth, "am far from wealthy, but I've raided my funeral expenses and managed to donate £2,000. Well done, Mr. Scarth. We're not suggesting that people rob their funeral expenses unless they are strongly called to do so. We're not trying to take money under false pretenses. The case is genuine. You can contact us through the details given there. But if we manage to get this out of the way, this Gulag case, then there will be a precedent in the European continent and Britain for further people to be liberated."
Yeah, a very important case. Thank you very much for that, Alex. Right, we're just going to end on this very quickly because, of course, Peter Hitchens came under fire from the BBC. Just a disgraceful interview. He's replied to this, so this is his blog, a reply to a smear. You need to read it because it's very important what this man says. But he's now, as a mainstream journalist, having to defend himself against the BBC's attack. And a few days ago, I was given a copy of his book, The Abolition of Liberty. I did read it many years ago, but I read it again. And I'd just like to say to people, he wrote this in 2003 originally, and he describes the abolition of liberty and the decline of order and justice in England. What he couldn't seem to grasp at that particular time was that the decline stems from deliberate orchestrated policy. And now in 2018, that policy is directly targeting him and other journalists. So I'm going to say very gently, you're nearly awake, Peter Hitchens, but you're not quite there. Well, that's it for today's news. Alex, thank you very much for joining us. And aside from the donations to the Hofschröer case, I'll also say thank you very much to the gentleman, 95 years old, I believe, who donated the UK column £100 today. Thank you very much for that donation. And we're going to say once again, if you're somebody who watches at the moment for free, we need your donations and your subscriptions to do what we do. So consider taking out a subscription. That's it for today. Thank you very much for joining us. Bye-bye.